Hi, I'm Brian Wieser from WPP's Group M. I'm the Global President of Business Intelligence. Thanks so much for tuning in to listen to me speak today and watch what I have to say. For background, those of you unfamiliar with me may want to know that I started my career as an investment banker, then became an equity research analyst, and then did an 8-year tour of duty in the advertising agency world, where I was able to put together a financial analyst's view of how the world operates and apply that to the advertising industry. I took a step away from that to become the CMO for an ad tech company shortly thereafter, and then went back to a Wall Street role where I became again an analyst covering much of the advertising industry. And for the last year and a half, I have been inside of Group M in this capacity where I oversee our thought leadership, primarily centered around this year, next year, which is our annual forecast of advertising trends. We cover more than 60 countries, including India. And in those numbers, we attempt to provide world-class estimates of how the advertising industry is faring in markets around the world and across different media. Supporting those views, though, we really have to start with an understanding of what's going on in the global economy and in economies of countries around the world. And it's been impossible to study any given economy without understanding the pandemic and how that's altering the world. It's safe to say that sitting here in late October, that the global economy has been badly impacted, but not as badly as we might have originally feared. Now, notwithstanding that India itself probably is faring a bit worse than might have been expected earlier on, the rest of the world has actually come out a little bit better than was originally anticipated. Now, to be clear, these are still historic declines that we're seeing. In the case of the United Kingdom, current estimates still have that economy as declining by more than at any rate than it has since 1707, which is stunning to think about. Other markets, such as the United States or most of Western Europe, it's only as bad as the Great Depression of the 1930s. So this is still pretty horrific by any standard. But again, we now know it could have been much worse. And there is still a wide range of outcomes in different countries. Certainly there's some relationship between how well an economy has managed the pandemic from a health perspective to how well the economy has fared. But you could even look at a market like Japan, where the death toll is relatively low, but the economy is very weak. South Korea, by contrast, similarly low impact from a health perspective, but a much stronger economy, relatively speaking. China, similarly, per the latest forecast from the IMF, should be some growth this year. Not a lot, but some. And that is saying something when you consider how far we've come since February. When we think about how markets such as the United States are faring, it's certainly going to be towards the bottom of the barrel, one of the worst impacted countries from a public health perspective, maybe more middle of the road from an economic perspective, but that's not a pairing that I think most people really want. Nonetheless, the scar damage from the pandemic this year will probably weigh on the economy as we go into next year. And that does have ramifications for the rest of the world. Because if you don't have a strong American economy, you don't have this source of demand for markets from outside the world. More broadly, the anti-trade sentiment that has certainly dominated the current administration and will have a lot of supporters if it is the Biden administration. So let's not assume that that changes regardless of the winner of the upcoming election. That anti-trade sentiment has negative consequences that will play out and serve to constrain growth for the economy in the United States and in markets around the world as we go into 2021 and beyond. So that gives us a muted sense of recovery. Again, some markets will have fantastically rapid growth, if only because their markets were so weak this year. The underlying trends supporting growth will probably resume normally in 2022 and beyond. Of course, this is all assuming that there is a vaccine and it's widely distributed by some point in the middle of next year. And so when we think about the knock-on effects of this pandemic and what it's meant for human behavior more than anything else, the transition to all things digital has been remarkable, both from a consumer side and from a business side. Faced with the threat of going under and lacking any business in many cases, it seems that small businesses in particular may have aggressively transitioned their operations online for the purpose of selling something rather than nothing. At the same time, large brands looking for ways to continue operating also try to prioritize their efforts online, although in many cases, many of them just concentrated their relationships with those retailers who remained open. And of course, consumers were more than willing to buy these products by any means available. I can speak from my own example. I am a very big fan of coffee here in Portland, Oregon. We care a lot about that. And I used to go to my local barista and pay $5 for a cup of coffee. And now I pay $75 for a 3-week supply of beans from that same barista sent to me in the mail, even though it's only 2 blocks away. And we are here now 7 months into this. It's a new habit. And I think that speaks to the broader trend that I don't think that we're going back or taking a step back. We have arrived at a new plateau for digital sales through e-commerce and other related channels. And future growth really will come from that new base. That has impacts on advertising, of course, as well. Now, maybe it's not always wise to directly map your media spending to the retail environments in which consumers are shopping. There are certainly advantages, but I think about the auto sector where faced with closure of retail stores where consumers typically look at cars, most auto manufacturers aggressively shifted all of their resources into online marketing in March and April. That kind of ignores that the life cycle of a car purchase could be 10 years or more. You go through this process, it takes a lot of time. It has very little to do, arguably, with a short-term exposure to a campaign. And so, nonetheless, this is what happens. And I think that across categories, marketers will have shifted their resources in support of their e-commerce endeavors, whether that's e-commerce led by traditional retailers, e-commerce from pure play sellers of goods, or direct-to-consumer properties. Now, every marketer will find that there are different types of platforms to prioritize. Those marketers who primarily sell their goods through stores which are deemed essential, food and beverage stores, and may have stayed open in many countries around the world throughout the pandemic, those manufacturers will probably have found that they need to rely even more on their traditional distributors. Their traditional distributors will be selling more online, and to the degree that manufacturers want to maintain relationships with those retailers, they will push hard on their digital sales through those third parties. And so that will lead to a certain series of digital and e-commerce related advertising solutions. Others, especially those who will have found that their primary retail outlets were completely closed or non-existent, will probably have realized that it's necessary to invest more heavily in their own controlled direct-to-consumer platforms, whether that's selling traditional services or traditional goods and services, or creating new ones. And certainly we've seen many examples of that throughout the pandemic. All of this becomes certainly necessary as we proceed through the latter part of 2020, where second waves or third waves or continuing never-ending waves of the pandemic continue to impact markets. Certainly a baseline expectation is that until there's both a vaccine and wide distribution of that vaccine, and a lot of consumers, the majority who are willing to take it, this new normal will persist in some form. So marketers still certainly have time. The other thing that I think will play out as we think about what's impacting marketers and the decisions that they'll make is this notion of geographic spheres. Certainly we're starting to see this, or we have seen it for a long time when it comes to dominant media owners in, say, Russia, or dominant media owners in China, and how they're entirely different than those who are dominant in most other countries. The global trade disputes that we've seen will, let alone geopolitical concerns, will certainly serve to amplify those spheres, or the interest in maintaining spheres from an economic perspective, let alone from a media perspective. And so it is important to think about how these platforms will be very different in different markets around the world. As we think about media consumption trends inside of this, maybe the most impactful change that we've seen through the pandemic relates to television. And television is, in most markets, certainly it was the go-to medium when people were locked in their homes. We saw in most markets around the world that there were very sudden spikes of consumption, call it 30%, as soon as a place went into a lockdown or faced restrictions on social activity. And the beneficiary of that was not exactly the incumbent broadcasters, although they often did fare better in April and May, but it was primarily the streaming services. And by that I mostly mean Netflix and Amazon Prime, others too. As the lockdowns or restrictions in most markets began to ease, traditional TV viewing trends started to look more like they were looking prior to February, which is to say most markets, stable overall growth, maybe a slight decline, but significant declines among key audience demographic groups. And so those trends seem to actually accelerate somewhat with respect to the declines in viewing of traditional TV among key audiences, while the total TV consumption more or less stayed in line. And what's likely happening, and it certainly is happening in the US, it's most likely happening in most other markets, is that the consumption of streaming services is becoming, it's growing faster than before from a new plateau. And the deep libraries that these platforms have certainly go a long way towards supporting that. Now, because these platforms are not ad supported for the most part, there are significant consequences for marketers. It means that it is harder to reach a core audience using television. Now, there are always going to be markets on Earth where there are significant sources of TV consumption which are not ad supported. Certainly, most countries with public service broadcasters have networks with significant audience share who do not sell advertising or sell much advertising. And marketers seem to make TV work in those markets. So I think that adding another 15 or 20% of viewing to some non-ad supported platforms in other markets may not be that big of a difference. But managing for reach and frequency is made more challenging. And it's arguably the single biggest challenge that the world's largest brands have. So long as they believe that television is the best way to convey a brand's attributes to consumers, to differentiate that brand from a competitor, to use sight, sound, and motion to amplify whatever elements the product is focused on. There really isn't a good comparison for that strategy. Digital media, broadly speaking, can't really satisfy it. Now, I should emphasize that when I talk about television, I mean premium video, typically long form. So in some markets, that might be different than what's in India. So Hotstar, for example, or Disney Plus, as I guess it's getting renamed, um, it is essentially TV in the context of what we would look at in many other markets. Certainly there's many points of view, but for the purposes of what I'm talking about, I think that most large marketers look at premium video more or less in the same way. It's clearly executed very differently. And so that does have operational considerations. To the extent that that kind of media vehicle is where most marketers want to concentrate their resources, there's going to be challenges to manage. And managing for reach and frequency, as I say, is probably the single most important challenge that many of those marketers will face. But as I said before, for the legacy brands who are shifting resources online to broadly map where consumer purchases are shifting, the issue becomes less of an issue with every passing year. But television isn't completely dying. I mean, I use the example of it being an iceberg, and it's calving large chunks of ice, but it's still an iceberg. And to the extent that there are always new advertisers who want to capitalize on the medium, that will help support growth. So when we think of the world's largest digital companies, so Amazon, eBay, Facebook as a marketer, Google, Tencent, Alibaba, Booking.com, putting aside the travel issues right now, it's not hard to find 10 players, 10 companies that account for 40 or $50 billion of annual spending, a substantial amount. And these companies have risen from zero not very long ago. So we have to remember that as those marketers transition their spending to more brand-centered campaigns, they will also shift resources into television. And that will help limit the decline. To be clear, we're not saying it's going to be meaningful growth for television as a medium, but certainly there are factors that are limiting the decline, even as audience declines start to become, they continue to become problematic. Maybe just continuing on a few other relevant topics here. When we look at other media that we're focused on, certainly television and digital capture the bulk of attention, but outdoor advertising warrants some discussion. This is an odd year for outdoor advertising. It is a year where many marketers have just tried to cut their outdoor spending entirely because the basic assumption is that people wouldn't be out of home. And it's true, most people are out of home a lot less, and in many cases their patterns of traffic are completely different. But that doesn't mean that they're not out there and not still able to look at a billboard in a relatively uncluttered environment. But it's a good illustration that value and price and spending don't necessarily map to each other. We do expect that, for the most part, outdoor advertising will have a pretty quick rebound. The underlying trends supporting outdoor advertising remain very positive, very favorable, especially as digital concepts are applied to the medium. Digital out-of-home advertising provides a lot of benefits for purposes of managing inventory, both from a buyer's perspective and a seller's perspective, integrating campaigns with other activities better. And so certain categories as well who historically have been skewed towards outdoor are likely to be strong again. So luxury and technology products, basically everyone wants to be like Apple. And I think that really encourages a lot of marketers to use the medium. Some irony, I just mentioned that out-of-home advertising is probably the least used medium this year, and it will rebound. The decline in outdoor advertising is forecast to decline by about as much as print, even including their digital extensions, despite being arguably the medium we need the most this year. And we don't expect any real rebound around the world for print, including their digital extensions. There will be exceptions, to be clear, because I think marketers, certainly where journalists and journalistic enterprises continue to invest in their platforms, in their content, marketers will follow suit. They will invest against strong media brands. Problem with newspapers and print and magazines as a subset of that, is that most owners of print publications have been disinvesting in their properties. And if there's no meaningful differentiation in the property, then why not just buy an audience on the web? And I think that's unfortunately what's happened. It's been, there's no real signs of that trend changing, at least at an industry level. Individual properties, individual media owners certainly are making a difference, and we can point to some of the world's best newspapers are absolutely investing more into their content, and they're focusing as much on audience data, which increasingly is helpful, especially in a world where first-party data will only become more and more important in worlds where the likes of Apple make it restrictive to use cookies or other forms of audience identification. And so there's still a solid future for journalistic enterprises who invest against their business. Well, as I see we're approaching the 20-minute mark, I understand that there are questions, and a few have been sent to me, so I will address them now. The first question: as marketing is the internal function of any organization, an organization would like to have its own digital marketing team in-house. And with growing trends where organizations prefer to have in-house digital teams for various benefits, what does the future hold for digital agencies? Where should they focus and build skills and expertise to be and stay relevant? A fantastic question, and one that I certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about. As an analyst covering stocks associated with the advertising industry, including my own company and our current competitors, this was an issue that would come up certainly from the first days of my coverage. I think there were marketers who started by assuming, and investors certainly, who thought that because a marketer can buy directly, they will. Well, there are some marketers who think that's reasonable, that because they can do something, they should. And many of those marketers aren't always counting all of the hidden advantages, if you will, from working with agencies. Those advantages primarily are things like expertise and knowing the best tactics to work with marketers. Now, in a world that is stable and static, a marketer probably can build out their plans and their teams and their workflows and everything else, and develop expertise probably almost as well, if not just as well, as a large agency. And you know, to that I point out Anheuser-Busch famously for decades had their own television buying operation in the United States until very recently. And if you're them and you're primarily advertising on sports, and you know how to do that better than anyone else, and you're integrating tightly with sports-related activities, well, it made sense, I think. And again, there's many other examples like that where you have a static world. The other situation where it can make a lot of sense certainly is where you're too small, or where the brand is too small to justify working with an external partner. But then when we think about you know, even marketers who need to be able to tightly integrate data that maybe is proprietary, and they're large and they need to benefit from skills, they can still stand to work with agencies and benefit from the expertise that agencies can bring. And there's plenty of hybrid models that that can work. I do think that as we look forward, that many marketers will find that, you know, the world is not static, but the best advantage and the best reason for a marketer to want to manage work themselves may very well relate to tightening the times between developing an idea, gathering data, and running a campaign. And again, there are many advantages to still working with agencies in support of those initiatives, and there's many examples of marketers where we do something like that. But it's more of an understanding that marketers will do it regardless of whether or not it's the best thing, but they'll certainly try it in many cases. And in some cases, they'll find that it works well with their organization, and they have all the right ways to work together between brands and marketing teams. And in many other cases, it won't. We certainly have seen many cases where marketers have brought this sort of work in-house and then sent it back out. Again, I'm talking now mostly about a world where things are relatively static and stable. To the extent that the world is not static and stable, and that over a multi-year period of time, you could assume that today's dominant players as media owners maybe aren't dominant media owners, or maybe as a marketer, you want to make sure that you don't feel like they're dominant and that you feel like you always have strategies and alternatives to work with. You're going to need best practices that come from continuing to work with agencies. So I make that point in context of, what does the future hold for digital agencies? I think that certainly partnering with and supporting a marketer's objectives is first and foremost the most important thing. If a marketer, for one reason or another, feels very strongly that they are better off for managing work in-house, finding ways to be supportive, no different than law firms have teams of lawyers who support companies' general counsels. And maybe a company has decided they're going to manage most of that work in-house, but they still benefit from external parties. So that sort of high-level advisory work can be one way. Another way is to make sure that if maybe the marketer wants to maintain the high-level work, but it's the low-level stuff that requires so much scale, and maybe the company isn't willing to invest against that kind of scale to make for an efficient operation. Well, so then there's managing that scaled workflow. But more generally, and this is sort of the thing that ultimately will support the value of agencies, it's all about ideas and the best ideas. And by ideas, I mean both at the creative side, where it's about figuring out what the great big concept is that will help a marketer differentiate themselves from everyone else, and ideally then tying that to the underlying product. But also ideas about how to make media work, and how to make advertising better for people, for customers, for partners, etc. And I think that a lot of those best ideas will come from the people who have the best ideas. The question will be, can you as an agency attract the best people? Because I think that it's safe to say that the most creative people, well, truly can be found anywhere. They're more likely to end up concentrating with other people who are comparably good. And so that becomes the real attraction of agencies, I think, in a world where a marketer can insource. Again, it doesn't mean that they will, and it doesn't mean that they always will. I guess the last question for right now reads, due to clutter, consumer attention span and recall is a potential challenge now. How do we see the next set of technologies making it experiential for consumers? So let me take that through the lens of clutter in general and challenges with consumer attention. First of all, I come back to the point I just made about big ideas. To the extent that you have a standard idea about what a brand stands for, that will cut through all clutter. I really believe that. I think that every marketer should think in terms of their first dollar going towards their brand, and then the next dollar going towards the product that supports what that brand promises. Beyond that, now we look at the tactical level. I think the big issue is always, and this is a philosophical point, every marketer should go into a situation with a BATNA, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And that really means making sure that you're thinking through alternatives. If television, for example, has become cluttered or too cluttered, and you feel it's diminishing in value, or the same could be true on the web, maybe there's too many ads per minute of time exposure that a consumer faces. Well, what's your next best alternative? I realize that's part of the question, but this should be an ongoing exercise. And what that next best alternative is may not be a media choice. It might be a broader marketing choice. It could also be that you need to reassess the metrics you're using. So, for example, maybe you're buying media from a publisher who's selling too many ads. Maybe it's possible to buy all of the ads. And that is to say, maybe your prices will go up, but your value might go up by more. So the more you can maintain flexibility on all the variables that go into how you think about media, I think will be really key to managing a world with increasing clutter and challenges in engaging with consumers. I'll leave it right there for now. But if anyone has a question beyond this, or you'd like to reach out to me, I can be found at brian.wieser, W-I-E-S-E-R, at groupm.com, or just go to groupm.com and you can find some of the things we've written, get our publications, we have mailing lists for various things. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the event, and thank you very much for taking the time. Have a great day.